was the high-flying superstar of wrestling. But now Jimmy Superfly Snuka is in the battle of his life.
The Superfly!
Wow, what a shot!
The Hall of Fame wrestler has just been charged with the 1983 murder of his 23-year-old Brooklyn girlfriend, Nancy Argentino. Paramedics found Argentino bruised and gasping for air at an Allentown, Pennsylvania motel shortly after Snuka completed a wrestling match. She died the next day. Authorities say an autopsy found the 5'7", 115-pound woman suffered from a fractured skull and 39 contusions and abrasions. Argentino's sisters pushed prosecutors to reopen the investigation decades after her death.
The family of Nancy Argentino has been notified about Mr. Snuka's arrest, and I want to thank them for their patience during the time that this case was being investigated by the grand jury.
Nancy Argentino was a vibrant 23-year-old with dreams of making it big in the world of acting and modeling. She had an infectious energy and a bright future ahead of her. However, on a fateful evening in May 1983, her life would be tragically cut short under circumstances which remain as murky as they are haunting. Nancy was romantically involved with Jimmy Superfly Snuka, one of the most electrifying and popular figures in professional wrestling at the time. Snuka was known for his high-flying moves in the ring and his wild, larger-than-life persona outside of it. But behind the glitz and glamour of the wrestling world, there was a darker side to their relationship, one filled with volatility, secrecy, and violence. On May 10th, 1983, Nancy was found unconscious and gravely injured in a dingy motel room in Allentown, Pennsylvania, where she and Jimmy had been staying after one of his matches. Snuka first claimed that Nancy had slipped and hit her head during a roadside stop earlier in the day. Later, his story shifted. He would then say that she had accidentally struck her head while the two were playfully sparring in their motel room. The extent of her injuries, however, told a far more disturbing story. Nancy was rushed to the hospital, but it was too late. She was pronounced dead shortly after arriving. Her autopsy revealed that she had died from traumatic brain injuries consistent with blunt force trauma. Her head had struck a stationary object with significant force. This wasn't a simple fall. Moreover, Nancy's body bore the marks of dozens of cuts and bruises, some fresh and some in various stages of healing. These injuries suggested a history of physical abuse, raising chilling questions about what she had endured in the weeks and months leading up to her death. Despite the troubling evidence, no charges would be filed against Snuka at the time. The official investigation was marred by inconsistencies and a lack of follow-through. The case quickly went cold, and Jimmy continued his wrestling career as if nothing had ever happened. For Nancy's family, the pain of her loss would be compounded by the absence of justice. They were left with deep and lingering suspicions that the full truth had been buried, perhaps intentionally. For more than 3 decades, Nancy's death remained a dark, unresolved chapter in the history of professional wrestling. However, her family never gave up. They would fight tirelessly to have the case reopened, determined to find out what really happened to Nancy. Their persistence paid off when, in 2013, the case would be reopened, leading to a fresh investigation into the happenings of that evening. In 2015, after years of mounting pressure and new forensic reviews, Snuka was finally charged with third-degree murder and involuntary manslaughter in connection to Nancy's death. it seemed, at last, that she may get the justice that she deserved. But, just as the case was gaining momentum, Jimmy's health would take a dramatic turn. He was diagnosed with dementia, and in 2017 would be found unfit to stand trial. He passed away shortly after, taking with him whatever secrets he may have held about that fateful night. Nancy Argentino's death remains shrouded in mystery, a case where the lines between accident and foul play blur into shadow. Was she a victim of an unfortunate accident, as Snuka claimed? Or was her death the result of something far more sinister, a consequence of a relationship marred by control and violence? The truth, it seems, may never be fully known. But what is certain is that Nancy was a young woman whose life was stolen far too soon, leaving behind a grieving family and a legacy of unanswered questions. Her story stands as a haunting reminder of how the bright lights of fame can sometimes obscure the darkest truths. Greetings, everyone, and welcome back to Memento Mori Stories. I'm Ella Favela, your guide through the darker corners of human experience. If you're captivated by the mysteries of life, where coffee fuels curiosity and tales of true crime send chills down your spine, you've found your place. Whether you're a returning listener or you're tuning in for the first time, I'm excited to have you here with us. So, find a cozy spot and let's dive into some spine-tingling narratives. Before we embark on today's journey, I've got a little insider tip. If you thrive on stories that challenge your perception and keep you on edge, make sure to hit that subscribe button and also ring the notification bell. I release new content every 2 weeks, and I'd be honored to have you along for the ride. If you're intrigued by what happens behind the scenes of my life, make sure to follow me on Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook. I've always got something exciting happening, and I'd love for you to be a part of my community. You'll find all of my social links conveniently on screen, and they're clickable for you down in the description box below. Speaking of excitement, here's something special for my Instagram followers. If you're the 250th person to follow at Memento Mori Art on Instagram, you will receive a custom painting created by yours truly, delivered straight to your door, absolutely free of charge. It's my way of saying thank you for your support and welcoming you to our ever-growing community. Now, we need to discuss what's coming up. Today's episode covers deeply impactful and sensitive topics that may evoke strong emotions. These aren't just stories. They're real-life events that have had profound effect on individuals and communities. Please be advised, this channel is not intended for minors. This episode includes graphic content and in-depth discussions on domestic abuse, violence against women, assault, and murder. Listener discretion is strongly advised. Given the intensity of these themes, it's essential to take care of your mental and emotional well-being. We believe in the importance of openly discussing these issues to foster understanding and empathy. However, we also recognize the potential for distress. If at any point you feel uncomfortable, or if these topics resonate too closely with your own experiences, it's completely fine to take a step back and to skip this episode. Your mental and emotional health is my top priority, and it's crucial for you to honor your own needs and boundaries. As we explore these harrowing tales, remember that our aim is not to sensationalize pain, rather, to honor the victims and to shed light on the realities they endured. We wish to create a space where these difficult conversations can lead to greater awareness and ultimately change. By understanding the darker aspects of human behavior, we hope to contribute to the broader dialogue on prevention and support for those affected by such violence. If you or somebody that you know is dealing with these issues or is carrying the weight of past trauma, please know that you are not alone. There are resources and support systems available to help you. I've included a list of links and contacts in the description box below that may offer you some assistance. Whether you seek support from a professional, talk to a trusted confidant, or simply take a break from these heavy topics, there are pathways to healing. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Let's approach these stories with the compassion and respect they deserve, and let's strive to learn from them in ways which promote understanding and healing. Now, it's time to grab your cup of coffee and settle in as we dive into the tragic and haunting case of Nancy Argentino. Nancy Argentino was a vibrant and vivacious young woman, full of life and promise. Born in Brooklyn, New York, she was raised in an Italian-American family that cherished close-knit ties and upheld strong cultural values. Her upbringing in such an environment fostered in Nancy a deep sense of loyalty and compassion, traits that would define her throughout her life. As the middle of three sisters, Nancy was known for her lively personality and her ability to light up any room she entered. She had a natural charisma, a magnetic energy which drew people towards her. Friends and family often described her as fun-loving, warm-hearted, and always ready with a smile or a joke to brighten someone's day. Her empathetic nature made her a confidant to many, always willing to lend an ear or a shoulder to those in need. In her early 20s, Nancy was finding her way in the world, navigating the delicate balance between youthful exuberance and the responsibilities of adulthood. She was deeply connected to her family, especially her mother and sisters, who were her best friends and biggest supporters. They were a tight-knit unit, sharing everything from daily joys to personal challenges, and Nancy's presence within this family was central, her energy and enthusiasm often setting the tone for family gatherings. Nancy was ambitious and driven, though she was still exploring what path she wanted to carve out for herself. She was considering various career options and was keen on finding something which would allow her to express her creativity and to connect with others. The world was wide open to her, and she was excited about the many possibilities which lay ahead. In addition to her many ambitions, Nancy had a deep love for music and pop culture, which would lead her to the vibrant entertainment scene of the early 1980s. It was a booming time for rock and roll, flashy fashion, and larger-than-life personalities, all of which intrigued her. She loved attending concerts and events, soaking in the electric atmospheres that such settings would provide. It was in this context that Nancy's life intersected with the world of professional wrestling, a burgeoning spectacle at the time. Through her social circles, Nancy found herself in the orbit of various celebrities, including professional wrestlers who were then becoming household names. She was captivated by the larger-than-life personas and the drama that unfolded in the ring, a world so different from her own. It was this very curiosity and her natural inclination towards excitement which would eventually lead her to Jimmy Superfly Snuka, a popular and charismatic figure in the wrestling world. Before meeting Snuka, Nancy was a young woman on the brink of discovering who she was and what she wanted from life. She was independent, yet deeply connected to her roots. and she had an innate desire to explore the world around her. Nancy's life, full of promise and potential, was tragically cut short before she could fully realize her dreams. Her story, sadly, has often been overshadowed by the infamy of her death and the many controversies surrounding it. However, it's important to remember that Miss Argentino was much more than just a victim. She was a daughter, a sister, and beloved friend whose life had its own intrinsic value, separate from the tragedy which would come to define her in the public eye. Before he became a central figure in one of wrestling's most notorious tragedies, Jimmy Snuka was already a legend in the ring, known for his high-flying maneuvers and charismatic persona. Born James Ryer in the Fiji Islands on May 18, 1943, Snuka's early life was marked by a blend of exotic locales and a journey of self-discovery that would ultimately lead him to the glitzy world of professional wrestling. Snuka grew up in a tropical environment that was as rugged as it was beautiful. His father, a native of Fiji, worked in the sugarcane fields, while his mother, who was of Samoan descent, imbued in Snuka a rich cultural heritage which would influence him deeply throughout his life. From an early age, he was drawn to physical activity and sports, particularly those which showcased his natural athleticism and strength. Snuka excelled in various sports, including boxing and bodybuilding, which would eventually become his gateway into wrestling. In the late 1960s, Snuka made his professional wrestling debut, initially working in Hawaii and other Pacific territories. His unique blend of strength, agility, and aerial skill quickly set him apart from other wrestlers of the time. He would soon adopt the ring name Superfly, which reflected his signature move, a high-flying leap from the top rope, which would captivate audiences and quickly become one of the most iconic maneuvers in wrestling history. By the 1970s, Jimmy had started to gain significant traction in the wrestling world. He moved to the mainland United States, where he worked in various wrestling promotions across the country. His exotic look, combined with his unparalleled athleticism, made him a fan favorite. He was often billed as a savage or a wild man, a stereotype which played on his Pacific Islander roots. However, Jimmy openly embraced this persona, using it to his advantage as he climbed the ranks of the wrestling industry. Jimmy's big break would come in 1982 when he joined the World Wrestling Federation, WWF, now known as World Wrestling Entertainment, WWE. The WWF was rapidly expanding, and Snuka's arrival coincided with the company's rise to national prominence. Under the management of the notorious Captain Lou Albano, Snuka quickly became one of the WWF's top stars. His feuds with wrestling legends like Bob Backlund, Don Muraco, and Roddy Piper are still remembered as some of the most intense and dramatic storylines in all of wrestling history. Despite his success in the ring, Snuka's life outside of it was quite tumultuous. His personal life was marked by a series of troubled relationships, substance abuse issues, and erratic behavior. Jimmy was well known for his wild lifestyle, which often involved heavy drinking and partying, a lifestyle which quickly took its toll on his relationships and his mental health. His intense physicality and daredevil style in the ring also contributed to a series of injuries, which would only exacerbate his dependence on painkillers as well as other substances. By the time he met Nancy Argentino in the early 1980s, Snuka was at the peak of his career. He was a household name, beloved by fans for his electrifying performances. Yet his personal life was spiraling out of control. The pressures of fame, combined with his own personal demons, created a volatile mix. In the years leading up to their fateful encounter, Jimmy's life had been a whirlwind of fame and excess, but it was also marked by instability and inner turmoil. The persona of Superfly may have been larger than life, but behind the scenes, Jimmy Snuka was a man grappling with the weight of his own success and the dark shadows it cast upon his life. Before meeting Nancy Argentino, Jimmy Snuka had been married twice. His first marriage was to Sharon Georgie in the early 1960s. They would have 4 children together, including Jimmy Snuka Jr., who would later become a professional wrestler known as Deuce. Their marriage was reportedly quite tumultuous, marked by periods of separation and reconciliation, until Sharon would eventually file for divorce. After his marriage to Sharon ended, Snuka married a woman named Carol. Details about his marriage to Carol are more obscure, but it was widely known to be short-lived. By the time Snuka met Nancy Argentino in the early 1980s, both of his marriages had ended, and he was living a chaotic lifestyle on the road as one of the biggest stars in the WWF. These past relationships would be marked by the same volatility and instability, which would later characterize his relationship with Nancy. The meeting of Nancy Argentino and Jimmy Superfly Snuka was a collision of 2 very different worlds. One, a young woman from a tight-knit Italian-American family from Brooklyn, and the other, a wrestling superstar soaring through the heights of fame in the chaotic and often seedy world of professional wrestling. Nancy was living in Brooklyn at the time, working as a secretary when she first encountered Jimmy. The exact circumstances of the day they met are shrouded in the mystique that often surrounds such star-crossed encounters. However, it's believed that they met after one of Snuka's wrestling matches in the New York City area. The professional wrestling circuit in the early 1980s was a traveling spectacle, with wrestlers moving from one city to another, performing in front of packed arenas, and basking in the adulation of their fans. Nancy, who was described as vibrant, kind-hearted, and full of life, was captivated by wrestling. It was an era when the sport was becoming more mainstream, with larger-than-life characters like Superfly leading the charge. Known for his high-flying acrobatics and his savage persona, Jimmy was a fan favorite, especially among women who were drawn to his wild charisma and rugged good looks. Nancy would be no exception.
We realized this is ridiculous. We have to do something about this.
Nancy's sister Lorraine never stopped pushing prosecutors to reopen the investigation.
We got the word out. And then we contacted the DA and said, hey, look at all the things that are going on here. And can't you do something about it?
Lorraine was working here at her flower shop in Manhattan when she got the call she had been waiting for more than 3 decades. The district attorney from Pennsylvania told her that Jimmy Superfly Snuka would be charged with her sister's murder.
Well, I felt that at least someone is going to be accountable, be held accountable for this.
Their relationship began with the kind of intensity and excitement which often characterizes the early days of a romance, especially one steeped in the glamour and unpredictability of the wrestling world. Nancy was quickly swept up in Jimmy's fast-paced life, traveling with him as he moved from city to city, attending matches, and experiencing the adrenaline of the wrestling scene firsthand. It wasn't long before she became a regular presence at his side, known among the wrestling community as Snuka's girlfriend. For Nancy, being with Jimmy was thrilling. He was a superstar, a man adored by millions, and he showered her with attention, bringing her into a world that was far removed from the quiet streets of Brooklyn. The allure of fame, coupled with Jimmy's magnetic personality, was intoxicating. However, beneath the surface of their seemingly glamorous relationship, darker elements would begin to emerge. As Jimmy's girlfriend, Nancy was exposed to the grueling and often dangerous realities of professional wrestling. The constant travel, the physical toll of the matches, and the intense pressure to maintain his status as a top performer weighed heavily and constantly on Jimmy. This pressure, combined with his erratic behavior and substance abuse issues, created a volatile environment that Nancy was increasingly drawn into. Their relationship was marked by both passion and turbulence. Friends and family of Nancy noticed changes in her demeanor, and there were reports of troubling incidents between the couple. Yet, like many drawn into the orbit of a troubled celebrity, Nancy seemed determined to stand by Snuka, perhaps hoping to help him through his struggles, or perhaps blinded by the intensity of their connection. In the end, what began as a whirlwind romance between a rising star and a young woman from Brooklyn would take a tragic turn, leaving Nancy's family and friends with so many more questions than answers. Their relationship, marked by both love and danger, would ultimately become one of the most infamous stories in wrestling, casting a long shadow over Jimmy's career and forever altering the course of Nancy's life. Despite her family's many protests, Nancy would continue to fall deeper and deeper in love with Jimmy. Her sisters would later describe how they saw him as a dangerous influence on Nancy, and they would constantly urge her to break up with him. Their fears were not unfounded. This relationship was characterized by frequent arguments, physical altercations, and a general air of fear and instability. According to her friends and family, Nancy was often seen with bruises, which she would explain away, attributing them to accidents in an attempt to protect Jimmy's image. Snuka's history of violence towards women wasn't new. Before Nancy, he'd been accused of abusive behavior in his previous marriages, and these patterns of violence only seemed to escalate during his relationship with Nancy. In fact, an incident in January 1983, just a few months before Nancy's death, highlighted the severity of the situation. Jimmy was arrested for allegedly assaulting Nancy in a hotel room in Syracuse, New York. According to reports, she tried to leave after an argument, but Snuka became enraged, dragging her back to the room by her hair and slamming her against the wall. The charges were later dropped when Nancy decided not to press them, an unfortunate decision which foreshadowed the tragic events to come. Despite these many clear warning signs, Nancy stayed with Jimmy, possibly out of a mixture of fear, love, and the hope that things could improve. However, her family remained deeply worried. They frequently urged her to end the relationship, believing that Snuka's violent behavior would only escalate. Nancy's sisters tried to intervene multiple times, but Nancy, caught in the web of an abusive relationship, seemed unable or unwilling to sever ties with Jimmy. As the relationship progressed, so too did the volatility. Snuka's demanding wrestling career and lifestyle of excess, marked by substance abuse and the pressures of fame, would only add further strain. Nancy's role in his life seemed to shift to be that of a caretaker, often trying to manage his outbursts and to shield him from the consequences of his behaviors. However, this dynamic took a deep toll on her, physically and emotionally. On May 10th, 1983, the worst fears of Nancy's family would be realized. After a night in their motel room following a wrestling match, Nancy was found unconscious and would later be pronounced dead from traumatic brain injuries. Snuka's explanation of these events was inconsistent and suspicious, fueling speculation that their troubled relationship had ended in murder. Despite the physical evidence and Jimmy's history of violence, the case remained unsolved for decades, leaving Nancy's family without justice and with burning questions about what really happened that night. On the evening of May 10th, 1983, Jimmy Snuka was in Allentown, Pennsylvania, for a World Wrestling Federation event. He was, of course, accompanied by Nancy, who had been traveling with him as he toured for his wrestling matches. The couple checked into room 427 at the George Washington Motor Lodge, a modest motel located near the Allentown Fairgrounds. Earlier that day, Jimmy had participated in a televised WWF taping at the Allentown Fairgrounds. According to Snuka's account, after the event, the couple returned to their motel room. He claimed that they were both tired and that Nancy wasn't feeling well. Snuka would later tell various versions of what transpired in the motel room, which would ultimately contribute to the confusion and suspicion which surrounds this case. One version of Jimmy's story is that Nancy slipped and fell while trying to use the bathroom in the motel, hitting her head on the metal frame of the bed or on the floor. He claimed that she was conscious after this fall, but complained of feeling dizzy and tired. Snuka said that he helped her into bed, and believing she just needed some rest, he left her there to recover while he went outside to make a phone call to a friend. Another account suggests that the injury may have occurred earlier in the day. Snuka initially claimed that Nancy had slipped and fallen while they were stopping at a rest area along the highway, hitting her head on concrete. He mentioned that Nancy seemed dazed after this fall, but insisted that she was okay and continued with their day as planned. Despite this, no one at the motel or the arena reported seeing any signs of injury on Nancy that day. When Jimmy returned to the motel room after making his call, he found Nancy unresponsive in the bed. Panicking, he claimed to have tried to revive her, but quickly realized that something was seriously wrong. He ran to the motel's front desk and asked for help. By the time emergency responders arrived, Nancy was barely clinging to life. When Jimmy arrived at Lehigh Valley Hospital Center's emergency room, his behavior did not go unnoticed. A nurse on duty observed his unsettling demeanor. This nurse described Jimmy as a, quote, tall man with a Hawaiian skirt who seemed oddly detached. His eyes were bloodshot, his expression one of palpable fear, and there was a noticeable smell of alcohol on his breath. He refused to sit in the waiting room, choosing instead to stare blankly ahead. To the hospital's chaplain, Snuka offered a vague explanation for Nancy's condition, suggesting that she might have, quote, hit her head on the side of the chair or the bed. This disjointed account did little to clarify the nature of her injuries. Attempting to shape his own narrative, Jimmy would later recount the events of that evening in his autobiography, which offered a version of the story which seemed to keep shifting with every telling. According to Snuka, he and Argentino were driving to Allentown in their purple Lincoln when Argentino needed to stop by the roadside. Snuka claimed he stayed in the car, sipping on a drink, while Argentino went to relieve herself. Upon her return, Argentino reportedly told Snuka that she had slipped and hit her head. Snuka's recollection was that she mentioned slipping while jumping over a small stream, although he hadn't witnessed the fall himself. Jimmy would downplay the incident, noting that Nancy had only complained of a headache with no visible blood. He claimed that after the fall, they stopped drinking, although it was unclear whether this was due to Argentino's injury or for another reason. Upon reaching the motel, Jimmy said they both took a nap. He later returned to the motel between his TV appearances, surprised to find Nancy still in bed. He described waking her up, only to find that her breathing was labored. Despite calling an ambulance, Nancy was pronounced dead at the hospital just 2 hours later. Snuka wrote in his autobiography,
"I think she died of a fracture to her skull. I was devastated."
However, Detective Gerald Prokanen from the Whitehall Police Department, who interviewed Snuka at the hotel, documented a much different version of events. Snuka had told him that around 4 a.m., Argentino had found a bush to use as a toilet. Snuka reportedly told her to hurry, and as she, quote,
"jumped across the grass onto the road,"
she, quote,
"slipped and fell backwards onto the concrete."
Snuka claimed he scooped her up and tried to revive her by slapping her in the face, but Argentino remained unconscious. He recalled asking her if she was okay, and she had responded with discomfort about her head. Despite the alleged severity of her fall, Jimmy didn't take her to the hospital. Rather, they drove straight to the motel. Reports suggest that Jimmy, who was reportedly without a valid driver's license, managed to get them there. After Nancy asked to lay down, Jimmy left for his wrestling performance at the Allentown fairgrounds. He even recalled telling her, "I'll see you later, honey. I'll be right back as soon as I get done," and then kissed her goodbye. When Jimmy returned, he allegedly tried to comfort Nancy with food and wet towel compresses, but her condition steadily worsened. He grew increasingly concerned and, seeing her critical state, called the front desk, urgently requesting medical assistance. Despite these efforts, it was simply too late. Nancy Argentino's life was tragically cut short, leaving behind a tangled web of accounts and unanswered questions about the true nature of her final hours. At just 23 years old, Nancy was pronounced dead shortly after midnight.
Nancy Argentino was found bruised and gasping for air in their motel room in Allentown, Pennsylvania. 23-year-old Nancy died the next day. An autopsy found she suffered from a fractured skull and 39 contusions and abrasions. But the investigation went nowhere. It languished in the cold case file.
Nancy would succumb to traumatic brain injuries which indicated that her head had struck a stationary object with great force. The autopsy would reveal over 24 cuts and bruises scattered across her body, on her head, ear, chin, arms, hands, back, buttocks, legs, and feet. These injuries suggested a pattern consistent with severe domestic abuse. Forensic pathologist Isidore Mihalikis, who conducted the autopsy, noted that the circumstances warranted a homicide investigation until proven otherwise. Leahy County Deputy Coroner Wayne Snyder, upon examining the body and consulting with Mihalikis, immediately suspected foul play and alerted the district attorney. The shadow of suspicion had long hovered over Snuka, who had a troubling history with Argentino. On January 18, 1983, Jimmy was arrested in Salina, New York, following a violent altercation with Nancy at a hotel. During this incident, Snuka resisted several deputies who responded to the hotel manager's call for help. Although Nancy initially pursued legal action, she would later retract her complaint. There are multiple allegations that Vince McMahon, a prominent wrestling promoter, intervened to dissuade her from pressing charges. Investigative journalist David Bixenspan has speculated on McMahon's potential influence in the case. Despite the alarming evidence and Jimmy being the sole suspect, formal charges were never pressed against him at the time, leaving the case officially unresolved. In 1985, Nancy's parents sought justice through a civil lawsuit and would secure a $500,000 default judgment against Snuka in the U.S. District Court in Philadelphia. However, Jimmy claimed financial inability to pay the judgment, and it appears that the amount was never collected. At the time of Nancy's death, Jimmy was already enmeshed in a life of complex personal entanglements. He was a married man with children, known for his numerous alleged affairs. To Snuka, Nancy was not just a mistress, but his, quote, East Coast girlfriend, a term he used to describe their relationship. In his autobiography, Snuka recounted their time together, stating, quote, "We slept together each time, but we also hung out." While Jimmy openly admitted that his marriage to Sharon was troubled and marked by infidelity, he would downplay his violent behavior towards her. He described their tumultuous relationship in his autobiography, claiming that their frequent fights were a result of him trying to prevent Sharon from hitting him, asserting that he, quote, "never used full force." "I don't like confrontation," he wrote, although this narrative would conflict with documented evidence of multiple assaults. In October 1983, the wife of Snuka's manager, Buddy Rogers, documented Sharon's injuries resulting from a severe beating she took from Jimmy. These records included photographs and notes on Sharon's hospitalization following the attack, highlighting a troubling pattern of violence. When asked, Sharon Georgie would decline to comment on Snuka's murder charges, stating, quote, "I have nothing further to offer." While Jimmy claimed that Nancy was aware of his infidelity and seemed to accept it, her family perceived their relationship quite differently. Nancy's sister, Lorraine, revealed that Snuka had made several appearances at family gatherings, including Thanksgiving at the Argentino home in Brooklyn. The couple even discussed buying a townhouse together in New Jersey. Lorraine expressed shock at discovering Jimmy's double life only after Nancy's death. Their relationship, however, did have rocky moments. 3 months before Nancy's death, she was involved in that disturbing incident at a Howard Johnson hotel in Salina, New York. During this episode, Jimmy allegedly dragged a naked and screaming Nancy through the hotel corridors. In the midst of the chaos, Nancy managed to call her sister, Lorraine, seeking help. Lorraine recounted, "Nancy called me at 2 a.m. saying, 'I have to get out of here.' Another call would come from the hotel owner, reporting that Jimmy was pursuing her. When police arrived, Snuka barricaded himself and Argentino in their room, leading to a confrontation with 8 deputies and canine units before he was finally arrested. Jimmy would later downplay this incident in his autobiography, describing a night of heavy drinking and drug use. Jimmy would maintain that the police raid disrupted what he portrayed as a harmless party, and he denied any physical violence towards Nancy, asserting, "I did not assault Nancy. She was fine." He also mentioned that he pled guilty just to move forward from the matter, and, in the end, the charges were dismissed after he paid a fine. Despite her family's multiple warnings, Nancy continued her relationship with Jimmy. Lorraine recalled their efforts to persuade Nancy to leave him, saying, "We tried to talk some sense into her, but she'd just keep going back on the road with him." The family's concerns were not only for her well-being, but also for her future. Tragically, Nancy's plans to visit home for Mother's Day were cut short by her death. Lorraine described the heart-wrenching moment her mother received the devastating news. "My mother thought she was on the way to visit. Instead, she got the call that no mother would ever want to receive." In the quiet hours of the night before that call came, Lorraine had felt an unsettling premonition. "That night," she says, "I felt very strange. It was 4 a.m. and I was already up. It was devastating." Nancy Argentino's tragic death would expose numerous failures in both the media and law enforcement, which would linger for decades, underscoring a complex web of negligence and bias which prevented justice from ever being properly served. In the wake of Nancy's death, the media's initial coverage of the case was both limited and superficial. Despite the severity of her injuries and the dubious circumstances surrounding her passing, mainstream news outlets failed to provide the in-depth reporting that may have spurred a more vigorous investigation. Instead, the media's focus was fleeting, often relegating the story to brief mentions or dismissing it as another tragic yet isolated incident. Ultimately, the lack of sustained attention contributed to the public's quickly fading memory of the case and would allow crucial details to slip through the cracks. Part of this media failure can be attributed to the prominence and influence of Jimmy Superfly Snuka. As a high-profile wrestler with a significant fan base and even more significant connections within the entertainment industry, Snuka enjoyed a level of protection and public sympathy which shielded him from the intense scrutiny typically directed at such cases. This celebrity shield meant that the media often refrained from probing too deeply into Jimmy's past or into his potential involvement in Nancy's death, instead opting for sensationalized headlines which did little to advance the search for truth. Law enforcement's handling of the case was marked by a series of troubling oversights and delays. The initial investigation into Nancy's death was hindered by a lack of urgency and thoroughness. Despite the clear indications of severe trauma and domestic abuse, the case was treated with a degree of complacency. Snuka, the primary suspect, was not charged at the time, leaving the case open but largely dormant. The reluctance to pursue charges against a high-profile figure like Jimmy demonstrates a troubling intersection of celebrity influence and legal negligence. Furthermore, there was a significant failure in the follow-up actions by law enforcement. The case remained open for years without significant progress, and the potential leads were never aggressively pursued. This inaction was compounded by the fact that Nancy's family faced substantial challenges in seeking justice. They were left with the burden of pursuing civil litigation, which ultimately resulted in a default judgment against Snuka that he never paid. This civil judgment was a small consolation in a system which failed to deliver any criminal justice. The media and law enforcement's failures were not isolated incidents, but rather part of a broader pattern of systemic issues. The lack of comprehensive reporting and the leniency shown to Snuka highlight a deeper problem of bias and inadequacy in handling cases involving domestic abuse and celebrities. This case serves as a stark reminder of how influence can evade accountability through a combination of media indifference and legal incompetence. In summary, the mishandling of Nancy Argentino's case underscores a profound failure in both media and law enforcement. The insufficient media coverage, coupled with lackluster efforts of law enforcement, allowed Superfly to evade accountability, leaving Nancy's family and the public waiting for justice that was incredibly slow to ever arrive. In 2013, a dramatic turn in the case of Nancy Argentino's death brought the decades-old tragedy immediately back into the spotlight. For years, the unsolved mystery of Nancy's death had languished in obscurity, overshadowed by the celebrity status of her alleged assailant, Jimmy Superfly Snuka. However, the reopening of the case and the subsequent murder charge against Jimmy represented a significant, albeit belated, pursuit of justice. The key moment came on June 28, 2013, when Leahy County District Attorney Jim Martin announced that his office would review the case once more. This decision was spurred by the ongoing scrutiny and public interest in the case, as well as the renewed efforts by investigative journalists and advocates seeking to uncover the truth. For decades, the initial investigation had been marred by apparent negligence and a lack of urgency, leading to Snuka's evasion of criminal charges, despite his role as the prime suspect in Nancy's death. The reopening of the case followed the discovery of new evidence and the reevaluation of existing material. District Attorney Martin, alongside a dedicated team of investigators, began to re-examine the forensic evidence and witness statements that had previously been dismissed or overlooked. This fresh scrutiny was driven by growing concern about the inadequacy of the initial investigation and the need to hold Jimmy accountable for his actions. In January 2014, after months of re-examination, Martin announced that the case had been presented to a grand jury. This development was a critical step in moving the case forward, as it represented a formal legal process through which evidence could be assessed and charges could be brought. The grand jury's role was to determine whether there was sufficient evidence to indict Snuka on charges related to Argentino's death. On September 1, 2015, nearly 32 years after Nancy's death, Jimmy Snuka was officially charged with third-degree murder and involuntary manslaughter. This indictment came as a shock to many, reflecting a dramatic shift in the case's trajectory. The charges were based on the findings of the grand jury, which concluded that Snuka's actions had directly contributed to Argentino's death. The indictment detailed a harrowing account of Nancy's injuries, consistent with trauma inflicted by a moving head striking a stationary object. The evidence included forensic reports, witness testimonies, and Jimmy's own inconsistent statements over the years. This case had evolved from a seemingly forgotten cold case to a high-profile legal battle, largely due to the persistent efforts of those who refused to let Nancy's story fade into the background. The recharging of Snuka marked a significant moment in the fight for justice for Nancy Argentino. It represented a critical recognition of the failures that had plagued the initial investigation, as well as a commitment to addressing the long-standing grievances of the Argentino family. Despite Snuka's eventual conviction and sentencing, this case remains a poignant reminder of the challenges faced in seeking justice for victims, particularly when powerful figures are involved. However, these legal proceedings were not without their many challenges. Snuka's declining health and advanced age raised concerns about his ability to stand trial, and the legal process was fraught with delays and complications. Nevertheless, the charges brought against him were a testament to the enduring pursuit of justice. In January 2016, Snuka was deemed unfit to stand trial due to his deteriorating health, primarily related to his battle with terminal brain cancer. The legal system's efforts to bring him to trial were complicated by this declining condition, which included significant cognitive impairment. His defense team argued that his medical state made it impossible for him to participate meaningfully in his own defense. The court proceedings continued, with discussions around Snuka's competency, leading to many delays and much legal maneuvering. Despite every effort, in December 2016, the judge formally dropped all charges against Jimmy. The decision to dismiss this case was influenced by Jimmy's severe health issues, which had rendered him incapable of engaging in the legal process. The judge would ultimately rule that continuing with the trial would be unjust given his condition, effectively ending the pursuit of justice through the courts. On January 15, 2017, Jimmy Snuka passed away at the age of 73. His death marked the end of a lengthy and complicated legal journey that had cast a long shadow over his legacy. The dismissal of charges, combined with his passing, concluded a frustrating chapter that had been marked by both legal complexities and significant public interest. The case remains a stark reminder of the difficulties in seeking justice for long-standing unresolved cases, particularly when the accused's health and legal status complicate the judicial process. In the end, the story of Nancy Argentino, marked by tragedy and unresolved questions, ultimately brings us back to the woman whose life was so cruelly cut short. Nancy, a beautiful young woman with a future full of promise, was subjected to an inexplicable and violent end, which still remains a somber mystery. Despite the decades of legal wrangling and the media frenzy surrounding her death, Nancy's legacy is defined by the void left in her absence. Her life, once vibrant and filled with endless potential, was overshadowed by the brutality she suffered, a stark reminder of the fragility of existence and the devastating impact of domestic violence. The drawn-out legal battle and media scrutiny that followed Jimmy Snuka's indictment and his subsequent death underscore a harsh reality. The quest for justice is fraught with obstacles, and the pursuit of truth doesn't always yield the closure that victims' families desperately deserve. Nancy's story highlights the profound and painful journey of those left behind, her family, who grappled with grief while navigating the complexities of a legal system that never brought clarity or accountability to the situation. Nancy Argentino's memory endures as a poignant testament to the personal tragedies that often remain obscured by the headlines and courtroom dramas. Her life, though cut short, serves as a powerful reminder of the enduring impact of such loss and the urgent need for compassion and vigilance in addressing violence and domestic abuse. As we reflect on Nancy's story, we're reminded that the real tragedy extends far beyond the crime itself to the lasting grief and unresolved heartache borne by all those who loved her. Her name was Nancy Argentino, and this is her story. It is my honor and my privilege to place her directly where she belongs, at the center of this narrative, never to be forgotten. The painting I've been working on today is called Sortes qui facet. You have sealed your fate. And at the time of recording this voiceover, about 4:15 in the morning on August 14th, 2014, I'm about a third of the way through. At the time of writing this script, I had only completed the digital design and getting the sketch onto the paper, so while I still have no idea how long this painting's gonna take me, I was about 10.5 hours in as of 8:10 p.m. on August 9th, and I'll pop the total number of hours that it took me on the screen right now for the curious. It is 9 by 12 inches and will be composed of some combination of watercolor and gouache paints, Posca pen, India ink, and gilding foils on 300 GSM 140-pound cold-pressed block. It, as well as many of my other original works, are for sale, and my books are currently open to custom commissioned work as well. Now is a wonderful time to commission me. My prices will be going up in September, but I will honor my current rates for anybody who pays me a deposit until the last day of this month. I ship for free across Canada, but I'm happy to ship globally for a nominal fee as well. If any of this sounds interesting to you, please send me an email to hello@stageleftproject.ca. If you believe in the power of conversation, in dismantling the silence which shrouds domestic abuse, and in fostering empathy, then I invite you to be a part of the Memento Mori Stories community. Subscribe to our channel to stay engaged with thought-provoking stories, discussions, and creative expressions. Together, we can be a force for awareness, understanding, and healing. Your subscription is so much more than just a click. It's a pledge to be a part of a movement which embraces the power of storytelling to bring about positive change. Remember, every voice matters, and yours can be a catalyst for good. Subscribe, share, and let's continue this journey together. Remember, one day you will die, but for now, live well. Ciao for now.